All right. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about configuration management, a true life story. We're going to jump right into it. For those of you that don't know me, my name is John Picozzi. I'm the Senior Drupal Architect at Inc. We're a digital agency in Providence, full-service web agency. Some of our clients include Brown University, NBC Sports, and Blue Cross Blue Shield. A lot of our work revolves around complex integrations, commerce, multilingual accessibility. Myself, I'm a co-organizer of the New England Drupal Camp, a co-podcaster at the Talking Drupal podcast, and I'm a certified Acquia site builder.
Nice transition.
I like it.
I'm Nate Dentzau, Senior Developer at Chromatic. We're a full-service agency as well, specializing in Drupal, decoupled Drupal, WordPress, React, all the cool new features we're working with today. I'm an Acquia certified Grandmaster, one of the co-organizers for New England Drupal Camp, and the organizer of Drupal Providence, along with John here.
So before we get started, how many people are using configuration management in Drupal? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So for those of you that are using it, hopefully you get a little bit of something. We're going to be talking about some cool modules that can help you really enhance your configuration management. For those of you who aren't using it, we're definitely going to talk about why you should be using it, how important it is. So it's a little bit of something for everyone. But first, we're going to talk about what is configuration. So if you go to Drupal.org, they give you this. In Drupal, configuration is the collection of admin settings that determine how the site functions as opposed to the content of the site. So that's really important to understand. Content and configuration are two separate things. Content, we'll talk about this more, but content basically lives in the database. Configuration also lives in the database, but it can also live in code, or it can be stored in code. So here is a breakdown of what is content and what is configuration. So we'll go through this pretty quick. Content types are configuration. The nodes themselves are content. Taxonomy vocabularies, again, configuration. The terms themselves are content. Menus, again, configuration. The menu links are content. Blocks, there's a little asterisk there. We're going to talk about blocks a little bit more in depth after I finish this list. But blocks have configuration, but they also have content. So the stuff inside the blocks is considered content. Again, media types. Media types are configuration. The actual media assets themselves are content. So going back to blocks. Blocks are a little bit strange because configuration is stored for the block that basically tells you where the block's position, so on and so forth, but the content of the block is not stored in config, which can make it hard when you're moving that config from site to site. Something that we use at Oomph is the recreate block content module. That module actually gives you the ability to push the block from instance to instance, but it doesn't move the content. What it does is it pushes the config, and then it looks at the config and says, hey, there should be a block created for this, and it creates an empty block, which is basically a placeholder. So you still have to paste the content from site to site.
Cool. So both at Oomph and Chromatic, we like the workflow that Pantheon describes for the websites that are hosted there, which is code should always move up from the lowest environment to the highest environment. So you're doing local development, you're exporting your configuration into version control, and then you're pushing that up the pipeline to your dev, test, and live environments of Pantheon. And the same thing goes for content. You should always make your content changes in production and pull that database dump down.
Other types of configuration. Fields are configuration, views, image styles, language settings, system settings, facets if you're using Search API, and then modules themselves have configuration. So all of those things, when you're working with config management and you do a config export, you'll see the config for your modules, for your language, for your fields. So don't be scared. It's okay. So now that we understand what is configuration, what isn't, let's talk about where it's stored.
So configuration stored in the database is considered the active configuration. This is stored in the database because relational databases are fast, much faster than just the file system. Changes that you make in the UI are applied to the database, and the changes are made immediately. Unlike if you are working locally, you're exporting to the file system, they aren't, because you're going to have to do some type of manual importing, or if your CI process does config importing automatically, that will have to take place. And again, benefits here are performance and security is listed on Drupal.org. As already said, you can, when you work locally, you work anywhere, you can export your configuration to the file system. Drupal considers this the staged configuration. And you'll see this in a next slide where we kind of show a screenshot of the UI for configuration synchronization, where the config on your file system is staged because it's not actually active, because the active configuration is in the database. The benefits of this is portability, and not listed here is visibility. So you can see if you're working with a team of people, you export your config, you can actually have somebody review that to make sure you're not going to apply any adverse effects in production.
So we're going to talk about the configuration manager. Now keep in mind, this is actually core functionality. I want to call this out just because core has configuration management, and then there are going to be some modules we talk about later that add on to that core configuration. So configuration management in core is pretty awesome. You'll see actually in this screenshot right here, this is what the admin screen looks like. You have the ability to import and export configuration both through the UI, which is what you're seeing here, as well as through Drush. So you can run Drush commands to export, import your stuff. And this handles two types of configuration. Right, required configuration, so that's configuration that comes from modules, comes from Drupal core itself, and then optional configuration, which is configuration that you may have created, fields and so on and so forth.
The thing to note about optional config too in modules is that config in the optional directory will only be installed if it already doesn't exist in the database. So if you have a module that has a config entity and it may already exist in your site, and it's in the install directory, and you try to install that module, it will error out and say that config entity already exists. However, if you put that piece of config entity, that YAML file, in that optional directory, Drupal will look at it and say, okay, hey, this config entity already exists, I'm going to skip it because it's optional.
So in the UI here, you go to Administer Development Content Sync. You get this screen right here. Before Nate was talking about where configuration is stored, database versus file system. If you click on this little button right here where it says View Difference, you actually get something that looks like this, which is basically like a git diff. It'll tell you in the config file that you just clicked on what is active and what is staged. Now translate active and staged to active, what's in the database right now being used, stage, what is in the file system, and if you did a config import, would be imported. So here you can actually see commerce price list is not, or is enabled in our active, but not in our staged environment. So the configuration manager workflow by default is a single path. Basically, you do a config export. All of your configuration is exported to one folder within your code base, and then you can move that configuration from your local environment to your dev environment, to your stage environment, to your prod environment. So this is really good for small sites. Like on my personal website, this is the workflow I use because I'm not working with other people. Everything that's on prod can go to each environment, right? Doesn't work so great with larger websites that are going to have things like Google Analytics or Memcache, or you want to use Devel locally or on development but don't want to use it in production. So we would recommend larger sites using the modules we're about to talk about.
So configuration split. Who here is using the config split module? Cool. So if you're not using it, this is a contributed module. It allows you to import and export multiple sets of configuration by a defined split. And defined split means that essentially you can say, well, I only want this config entity or I only want this module to only exist in this environment or in this feature split. And we'll talk about what Oomph does and what Chromatic does, because we do config split differently. And to note here, here's the UI of the configuration split. This is showing the currently active or registered splits in configuration itself for the config split entities. And you can see here that the active split is local. This was a screenshot from a local environment. To note here that config splits are stored differently or config differently when you import and export them through either a complete split, so that's a module or a feature set that's going to split out that config and its dependencies, or a conditional split, which is I just want this individual configuration entity, could be devel.settings.yaml or something like that.
All right. So going into a little bit more detail about config split and complete splits versus conditional splits. This shows you a complete split. Basically, a complete split is just that. I want this in one split. I do not want it anywhere else. And what I mean by that is something like devel. You may do a complete split on devel in your development and your local environment if you're doing an environment-based setup. And that will not go to staging or production. So all of that configuration is actually taken out of the common folder completely and put into your splits config folder. So when you look at, we'll look at a little bit at the file structure, you'll see that we have a common folder, and each split has its own subfolder in the configuration folder. So going on, we're looking at a conditional split. Now this is something where I'm going to change config in each environment. I give the example here of Google Analytics, right? So if you wanted to have no Google Analytics key in your dev and your local, and then you wanted to have a staging analytics key for testing and then a production key, you could do a conditional split for that configuration, and each one of those instances could have their own configuration file for this. What this is doing is it's saying the majority of the configuration for the Google Analytics module is going to stay in that common folder, and then whichever is conditionally split out is going to be taken out of the common folder and put into each of the subfolders. So here with the config split environment workflow, you can see that this looks a lot different than just core configuration management, because what we're doing is we're working from a common config folder that applies to all of the environments, and then each environment has its own configuration folder that you can add certain configs to if you need to. What it does is it actually loads the configuration from the common folder for whatever environment it's on, and then pulls in those individual folders based on environment.
So at Chromatic, we do a feature split. So instead of environment-based splits where at Oomph they split out multiple modules and multiple different pieces of config for dev, stage, prod, we split by feature. So we split and say, well, we have a devel split, we have a Fastly split, we have a Solar split, we have a Redis split, and then we enable them per environment. So we'll have multiple configuration splits enabled based on the environment. At Oomph, there's only a single split enabled based on their environment workflow. So as you see here, this is kind of an overview of what the file structure looks like compared between the environment splits and a feature split. Both strategies have their pros and cons. As you can see here in the environment split, you have your common directory and then your environment splits. If you look at dev, local, and prod, you'll see that there's duplicate configuration here. You have search API, search API, search API, search API. In my opinion, that's the downside of the environment split, is that you're going to have duplicate configuration entities, and essentially what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to change out the environment you're on locally and export that config, or do a manual copy into each one of those directories from whatever split you have active. For the feature split, you can see overall this is cleaner. It looks cleaner because you don't have duplicate configuration. However, the downside is you don't have that per environment configuration. So you'd actually have to make an environment configuration override in your settings.php file in this case. Because you wouldn't be, or you could, I guess, do a devel dev split or a devel local split, but at Chromatic we do the environment overrides in our settings.php files. Here, this is what the settings files would look like between an environment and a feature split. So you can see here, as I just discussed, at oomph, there is just a single split that's active. If you look at the feature splits at Chromatic, we'll have multiple configuration splits active. If you look at local and prod, for local we have dev and stage file proxy enabled, and in production we'll have Fastly and Sentry Raven enabled for production.
And note here that each config split is actually turned off by default, and then we're enabling the config splits via settings.php. This works great if you're using, Travis or some sort of build tool to send your code out to different servers, because you can configure which split gets turned on when you're actually building and deploying.
Yeah, we do that with Ansible.
Next question.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
With the feature splits, so with environment splits, obviously you have a set number based on the number of environments.
Yep.
How do you determine when you need to create a new feature split? Like, what's your rule of thumb of what needs to be in a different feature?
So that's a really good question. Mike's question was, when do you decide you need a feature split, and what determines that? From my experience, it's basically module based. So you can see actually the splits themselves, devel, stage file proxy, Fastly, Sentry, Raven. These are all modules. So we do our feature splits by modules. But I mean, if you have a custom module that you just want a feature split from, or like a custom feature that you're building and you built custom configuration entities, you can do that. But really, we at Chromatic use the feature split to kind of have that flexibility of not duplicating that configuration per environment. But like I said, each kind of strategy has its pros and its cons. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So now we're going to get into some modules that you can add on to configuration management and config split to basically address some key features or key issues that you may have. First one is configuration read-only. So something that comes to mind is you're working with configuration management, you're working with config split, you have your splits, you have your configuration all set up. It's in the repository, right? And when you're doing, you're doing your deployment, you're importing that config to the environment, everything works great. Well, what happens if a user of the site, your client, goes in there and decides to start changing some things that are stored in config? Well, that could very quickly make the production config go out of date, which is not good. You're going to end up having to redeploy the site. You're going to blow away their work or the changes they've made. So here comes configuration read-only. What that does is it basically locks down anything that is config and allows for this nice little message here that says, hey, this is configuration. You can't edit this, because if you do, next time a deployment happens, it's going to get blown away. So this module works really well to basically lock down config items and prevent them from being updated. It does have whitelisting, so if you find an area where you're like, oh, I really need them to be able to update this item, because sometimes there are pages in Drupal that are actually a combination of config and content, you can whitelist that page and allow the admin to update that.
It is worth noting that this takes away the cowboy coding feature of Drupal sometimes, so making changes in prod. So my recommendation is have a solid CI pipeline and some testing procedures before you go ahead. If you have a CI pipeline that may take 30 minutes to deploy to prod and you just deployed a error, you're going to have downtime for probably 30 minutes. So it's just kind of a caveat with this.
along that same line, there is an entry you can put into settings.php to disable this. So if you were working in a production split locally, essentially you'd be locked out of editing config. But in your settings local, you can add this line to shut off configuration read only.
So another module that we like to use, both at Chromatic and Oomph, is the config ignore module, which complements config read only. And I say that by everyone to use the Lingotech module, the web forms module. We want to give our clients the ability to build web forms sometimes throughout the site. Web forms are configuration. So when they're in production building web forms and we do a deployment, we don't want to wipe out their web forms. So we can use the config ignore module and ignore the web form entities, or we can ignore the Lingotech entities who Lingotech stores translations into config. Again, it's a contributed module. It allows for the config to be ignored, both importing and exporting. We did this talk at NetCamp, and one of the suggestions coming out of NetCamp was that, well, what if there was a module that could communicate with both config read only and config ignore? So I actually built a module called config ignore read only. It's a great name. Stupid, sorry. The idea here is that your config entities that are ignored in this configuration page are automatically whitelisted for config read only. So you don't have to explicitly define in a custom module that I want my web form config pages in the UI to be editable. You literally just have to install this module, enable it, and anything that you whitelist in config ignore or enter in config ignore is automatically whitelisted for config read only.
And as Nate touched on here, at Oomph we work with translation quite a bit. We work with Lingotech quite a bit. Lingotech actually stores translations in two ways. It stores content as content in the database, or translations as content in the database. But then when it comes to items like facets and views, it actually stores them as config in your file system. So config ignore is a great tool to be able to say, hey, you know what? We're going to ignore that Lingotech configuration and let our user translate it all they want on production or staging or wherever they're doing the translation. So this module with Nate's add-on module is a great solution for that issue. So at this point, we'll take questions, and we appreciate your time. Rick.
We use config ignore on the NetCamp site to store API keys because it was in a public Git repo.
Yep.
Yeah, it was good use. I had a question about when you're doing the prod split, for example. Are you saying with Devel, for example, that when you select Devel in a prod split, you're saying don't include Devel in this config? Is that how it's working?
So what you're doing essentially, and the question is to kind of elaborate on how config split works with Devel in the production environment. What we typically do at Oomph is we will say, hey, Devel is only on for local and dev, and then that's a complete split. So that means it's taken out of the common folder completely and only applied to those two instances. And then the split for production just is left alone, because basically what's going to happen there is that's going to look at the common folder and pull in everything from the common folder, but Devel's not in the common folder because we've done a complete split.
So are you making a split of local and saying include Devel, or a split of prod and saying exclude Devel?
The first one. So we're saying our local split, our dev split, both are doing a complete split on Devel, which is including them in those splits, and then it's just not even a factor in production.
The idea of the complete split is that your sync or common directory has no context of what you're completely splitting out. So if you change your active split to the prod, and you imported config, and then you exported a database from your dev environment, for instance, that has Devel enabled, it'll try to actually export that module to the common directory because prod has no context that you even split that out.
So the reverse of that scenario is something like the purge module. We're only using the purge module on staging and production. I don't care about it for local or development. So that scenario is in reverse, where purge is actually completely split in staging and production, and then not even included for dev and local.
So when you're on your local environment and you export config without importing your local split, then you get those purge settings in your common directory. Yeah. Mike.
Have you ever had to deal with config, or how would you deal with config with like a multi-site setup, where you're using the same code base but multiple sites?
So that's very interesting. We're solving that problem right now at Chromatic. We have a client that we built a platform for, that way we can spin up multiple sites based on the same code base, but configuration on the box for distributions to use the same config directory is pretty difficult. I've arrived to the fact that it's a combination of a custom module implementing a plugin for config filter, which is what config split is based off of, and then using splits is what the config split module as well. It's we haven't actually tried it yet. This is all theory, but we're solving that problem right now because we're dealing with, we have 4 sites in this multi-site instance, and they actually have their own instances of config as well as their own splits. But as we build this out, we're realizing that the upstream of pushing up config changes that should be shared across all the sites is pretty difficult doing it this way. So my theory is there is actually a single common directory or a single sync directory for all the sites, and it's essentially a conditional split for everything else. And you then still have your feature splits as we use a Chromatic.
I would also add to that, completely separate. I would definitely look at your multi-site and determine whether it needs to be a true multi-site, or you could use something like domain access to be able to have a multi-site within one Drupal instance.
Yeah. Cool.
Any other questions? Rick? Yeah.
How again do you do blocks? How do you create the block so that it knows what to do with the config?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So actually in either one of our config scenarios, right, what we typically do is we'll create the block locally and then export the config. That basically just saves all the configuration for that block minus what you would put in the block body field, right? Then what we do is we'll push it up to, say, our staging server for client review, import the configuration using the recreate block content module. You basically do a cache clear that creates the block. It's empty, but it's still there and in the position it needs to be in. And then we just do a copy and paste of the content from either our local or development server to that block.
So that module is the key, because if you try to import it without that, it doesn't know what to do with it.
Yep, so by default, what will happen is you'll have a message where the block should be that says, hey, we can't find this block anywhere. Like, what do you want us to do? Any other questions? Comments? Concerns?
Cool.
Well, we appreciate your time, and hopefully you got something out of this.